Hi, folks. So the theme of the week is robots and artificial intelligence. Last week we talked about Frankenstein as sort of an origin point for a lot of science fiction. Now, science fiction wouldn't really start to take shape until the 19th century, and really the words didn't exist until about 1926 with Hugo Gernsback. But the focus of our robots and AI theme centers around a very particular point in time, as well as some contemporary connections today. So in the period of time that we are looking at with many of our stories, we are looking at the post-war era. The post-war era happens after World War II. Late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And this is a very particular time in American history, and especially in literature. We see a huge rise in the idea of a dystopia. We see a huge rise in writing about the future and technology and science fiction. And that was tied to a lot of things that were happening in the real world. So kicking back to Frankenstein for just a second. So Frankenstein becomes a basis for a lot of this. And what oftentimes people refer to the creature as is Frankenstein's monster. And I'm going to come back to the idea of a monster a lot throughout the course, but let's unpack that for a second. Throughout history, a monster was something either animalistic or a witch or a demon or something like that, something very fantasy oriented. But Frankenstein's creature created this new type of monstrosity, or this new sort of boogeyman for us to be scared of, and that is a monster of our own creation. The idea that the monster can be created, that we can be the cause of it, that we can bring this thing to life to, be our own undoing, that was very foundational to, or that becomes very foundational to a lot of literature, but particularly in the theme of robots and AI. So, one of the reasons that this was so affecting towards people has to do with the fact that this, Frankenstein's creature was created out of scientific ambition and hubris. And this is something that we still grapple with today, our own ambition coupled with our own hubris, so to speak. The idea of the created monster also creates a complicated relationship, right? So Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, they have a creator-created relationship, which, if we unpack that extends up to like playing God with nature and like what that does to our own sense of self. But they also have a sort of parent-child relationship in some respects. But in the case of Frankenstein and in many robot AI-oriented science fiction, the created actually, has more, is superior in a physical, intellectual, or all of the above sort of sense. So that becomes really complicated in how we deal with our relationship to those things. Now, in the post-war era, after World War II, the atomic bomb had just dropped. And we had also seen a ton of new technology in terms of modern warfare. And the atomic bomb was a really sort of, world-shifting event in terms of what human ambition was capable of in terms of destruction. Many would argue that that's related to the rise of dystopian lit right after the World War II. But we also see a lot of technological advancements. So in 1950, about 10% of U.S. households had a television. In 1960, 90% had a television. This is the era when microwaves, when indoor refrigeration, when all of these sorts of mass market production items, technology is making its way into people's homes. And this makes many people very, very nervous about our relationship with it, about what it will do to the family unit. And you can see all sorts of doom and gloom and fear, propaganda from that period of time. But we would be disingenuous if we didn't acknowledge that that still very much exists today, if not to a greater extent, right? The fear of what screens are doing to our brains, or what social media is doing, or what AI is doing. Like, those are still fears that exist today, and they really took off in this post-war era, and these science fiction stories are very engaged with those ideas. Now, some scholars would argue that in Frankenstein, the core of the story is Victor Frankenstein's desire to surpass everyone else in terms of human knowledge and creativity and original ambition. And that is sort of the source of his ultimate undoing. But it's still a very human thing, right? To want to progress and move forward. And that becomes the basis for a lot of science fiction, a lot of stories about robots and AI. So Frankenstein's monster, the idea of the created, which was related to things that were going on during that period of time. In the post-war era, it shifts into this technologically created monster, maybe not monster. I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, we're starting off with one of these sort of, godfathers of science fiction, and especially of literature related to robots and AI, and that is Isaac Asimov. Now, Isaac Asimov created the 3 rules of robotics that dictate how robots work in science fiction, and I'm going to let him explain those to you in the next video. He also wrote, many of the sort of foundational stories. He wrote the Robot series. This was something he was sort of, at the forefront of. He also was wildly prolific. I mean, the man was publishing from the 40s till the 80s. He was writing constantly throughout his life, and his fascination with the idea of a created robot, of our relationship with those things and what it might do, is something that he's very interested in. So you're reading 2 stories from him. You're reading Robot Dreams and The Last Question. So in terms of Robot Dreams, this is getting at something I'll unpack more in a later video with another story set. In terms of the line between human and machine. This is something that we still constantly grapple with, because as the line between human and, robot becomes thinner and thinner, and those things start to get closer and closer together, we generally as a species start to become very uncomfortable with what separates us from the monster, so to say, which is not to necessarily say that those things are always a monster, but just in the context of Frankenstein, our fear that this intelligent non-human thing is getting closer and closer and closer to this intelligent human thing, that's something that we're very fearful of, just socially and culturally, and have been for a long time. The last question, I want to highlight a concept that exists today, because you are going to read another story with a similar title later on in this week's series, The Last Curiosity. And the last question has to do with what happens after us. Another theme that permeates a lot of literature about robots and AI is our own mortality, right? We are biologically imperfect, meaning we don't live forever. Our existence is fleeting. But when it comes to technology, the idea that it will be here after us, and to what end and for what purpose, that is a question that science fiction deals with quite a bit. But the last question is, Isaac Asimov's story. But today, there's this theory or concept known as the last invention that we're anxious about, technologically, culturally speaking. And this is the point at which AI reaches a point that it no longer needs us to continue to evolve. Like right now, we do have machine learning. We have a lot of different, we have very advanced, we have advanced as far as humans ever have. But there is a fear that at one point that technology will become either autonomous or sentient or conscious, or that it will reach a point that it no longer needs us. And at which point, artificial intelligence no longer needs us to create, then that's the last human creation, the last invention, right? And that's certainly debatable, but I think just an interesting idea to sit with as you're reading these stories is the concept of the last invention, the last question, the last curiosity, and how that relates to the idea of the created and the monster is what we're looking at this week.